Well, first I want to thank Lucina and the Diversity Committee at OHBM for putting together this symposium on neuroscience in the LGBTQ community. I think it's really stellar to have that put together. So I'm going to talk about something I don't usually talk about, LGBTQ challenges in STEM and the need for data, especially federal data and policy change. So just to introduce myself, I am an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at NYU, and my lab and I study the cognitive and neurobiological mechanisms that allow people to make sense of their social worlds, and we're especially interested in these initial split-second perceptions of other people, especially through things like facial features, and we often use, unsurprising for this audience, functional neuroimaging, as well as computational modeling and behavioral paradigms. And we use these to understand often how things like our implicit biases or stereotypes might change the way that we initially perceive other people. And just to give one quick example of this kind of work, we often use multivariate fMRI in tandem with paradigms like computer mouse tracking to look at how initial visual representations in response to other people, so how we're visually representing another person's face, might be influenced by our preconceived notions or our stereotypes. So if you're interested in that kind of work, that's where we're coming from. But what I'm going to talk about today are LGBTQ challenges in STEM, something I've recently become interested and sort of concerned about. So I want you to consider these three different individuals. Lynn Conway is a famed engineer who developed what's called dynamic instruction scheduling that revolutionized a CPU's processing power. So the CPU of any modern computer in the world today is owed in part to Conway's work, which dramatically changed modern computing. But Conway, early in her career, Conway was assigned male at birth, decided to undergo a gender transition, and was promptly fired from her engineering job at the time because of being transgender. And this derailed her engineering career for years, but eventually was still able to contribute enormously to engineering. Alan Turing, as some of you probably know, was a mathematician who worked on the fundamental workings of algorithms and computation, and he developed the Turing machine. And he's widely regarded as the father of theoretical computer science and artificial intelligence. But Turing, when it became known that he was a gay man, he was illegal at the time, and tragically, he was sentenced to chemical castration and later committed suicide. And Sally Ride, most recently, was the first female astronaut in space. She was the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom and was a huge champion of women in STEM. But less known is that she was also a lesbian, and this was revealed posthumously by her partner of 27 years when she died in 2012. And experts in the fields of space aeronautics and that were familiar with her sort of talked about why she may have been so private and sort of closed off in her career. And one expert put it that if Ride had been out, it would have been a career wrecker. And even in spite of LGBTQ progress, I would not expect anyone in the current field to be out anytime soon, assuming one is gay or lesbian. And so, I think this shows certainly that LGBTQ people have first enormously, contributed to science and to technological innovation. But here we're seeing these cases ranging from kind of tragic persecution to being outright fired to having to live a kind of closed off life and keeping your LGBTQ identity private. And one question is, it's 2020, much has changed in our society. Do these kinds of experiences mirror anything that are currently experienced by LGBTQ people in STEM today? And it seems like some experiences are in fact shared. So in thinking about how society changed, it's important to remember that in the US, it's still legal in more than a third of US states to discriminate on the basis of sex orientation or gender identity. So it's illegal to fire an individual, to refuse hiring, or to deny promotion to an individual based on sex orientation or gender identity. And from a attitudes perspective, you can look at both explicit anti-gay attitudes, which are conscious preferences that are indicated, or implicit anti-gay attitudes, which are shown on the right, which are less consciously held biases, evaluative biases against gays or lesbians. And on the y-axis, 0 would be the marker for a lack of bias altogether. And these were data obtained from 4.4 million individuals from 2007 to 2016. And what you can see is that indeed there was a steady decline in anti-gay attitudes, both explicitly and implicitly, from 2007 to 2016. For implicit biases, a little bit less so. They seem to be a bit more entrenched and resistant to change. But most importantly is that still, as of the last time these data were analyzed, so 2016, these biases are still well above 0, and they're still strong and alive today. And these kinds of implicit and explicit attitudes could seep into the ways that we appoint faculty members, to the ways that we admit graduate students or hire lab personnel. They can also contribute, in theory, to an unwelcoming environment for LGBTQ people in STEM. And the data on experiences of LGBTQ people in STEM suggests that this is the case. And so there have been very few studies on LGBTQ people in STEM, but the data thus far suggests that LGBTQ people in STEM report more negative workplace experiences and are encountering less supportive STEM environments than non-LGBTQ people in STEM, and also than their LGBTQ counterparts in non-STEM industries. 69% of sexual minority STEM faculty members, meaning those identifying as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or queer, who are out at work, report feeling uncomfortable in their academic departments. More than 40% of LGBTQ people in STEM are not out to colleagues, so they seem to be isolated and don't feel comfortable being open about their LGBTQ identity, sort of as we saw with Sally Ride. And the most recent data that were obtained from the American Physical Society and the Institute of Physical Sciences, so in the field of physics, was that 21% in the US and 18 to 32% in the UK of LGBTQ people report being excluded, intimidated, or harassed at work due to being LGBTQ. 75% of these individuals feel uncomfortable at work, and these experiences predict a desire to leave their STEM field, so in this case, to leave physics. So really suggesting, kind of alarmingly, that there are a lot of non-supportive STEM environments and negative experiences that LGBTQ people can and are encountering in their STEM fields. A different angle to think about these sorts of issues that I think is really important is to think about this from a STEM pipeline angle. And this, the leaky pipeline, as it's called, has been extensively studied in the context of women in STEM and racial and ethnic minorities in STEM. And what you're seeing here is just the career pipeline going from when an undergraduate declares a STEM major to becoming a full professor and all the stages in between there. And in thinking about LGBTQ STEM individuals, it's likely that certainly a lack of role models, a lack of support, a lack of community, as this process unfolds, will lead to attrition and will lead to dropouts, right? And this is seen with women and racial and ethnic minorities in STEM. It's important to have a sense of belonging and to identify with your STEM career and field, and it's only possible through things like role models and community and support. But also explicit and implicit biases, attitudes, negative attitudes or harmful stereotypes can also play a role, as I just sort of alluded. And just to give an example of a few of hundreds of possibilities of what might be going on and why I think it's important to collect data on these issues is, for example, an undergraduate who is declared a STEM major might have a reduced sense of belonging, feel like this isn't a field for me. They don't see role models, and they don't get the sense that they belong in this field. Faculty members and lab members might not take them seriously due to negative attitudes or harmful stereotypes that these individuals might have very good intentions, but still might have these implicit biases that seep into their decision-making processes. LGBTQ undergraduates might not fit into their mold of what they believe is a stereotype. And again, this can happen in a very unconscious manner that can unfortunately have an effect, or sorry, could have an effect. At later stages, a prospective PhD student who is interviewing for an open house might be too visibly out or too open about their LGBTQ identity, perhaps, and judged as maybe unprofessional or off-putting because of this, again, in a kind of subtle manifestation of these sorts of potential biases. Later on, it could be that a PhD student who is undergoing a gender transition is seen as an indecisive person or as unstable and therefore not a good scientist. And a really critical stage of this pipeline that I think it's really important to hopefully get data on at some point, and I'm going to talk about that, are how stereotypical assumptions might play a role in obtaining a tenure track position. And we live in a STEM field, of course, in academia, where departments are looking to make tenure track appointments to individuals that they believe are going to be there for the rest of their working lives. It's really important to find a colleague that fits. But there might be this kind of perception that there's a lack of fit with the departmental, institutional, or local culture because LGBTQ individuals are only going to thrive in urban locations. And so a university in a non-urban location is not going to be a good fit for this person, or they don't mesh in a department that has a strong focus sort of on family-oriented department in a non-urban location. So these sorts of ways that implicitly or of course overtly LGBTQ individuals might fall out of the pipeline. And so I think it's really important that we get data on this and understand, as we do with women and racial and ethnic minorities, and of course how all of these would intersect, how this is unfolding for LGBTQ people. But let's just take a step back for a moment. Why is it important to think about diversity issues in STEM and to care about them? And really, the framework for this was the stage for this was set in 1980 by the Science and Engineering Equal Opportunities Act, which, when it was signed, Congress stated that it is, quote, in the national interest to promote the full use of human resources in science and engineering. And the idea is that, yes, this is absolutely an equal opportunities issue. We need to make sure that women and racial and ethnic minorities, persons with disabilities, people from different economic backgrounds are afforded the same opportunities. But it's also, and I think everyone can agree on this, is an issue of maximizing talent in the US scientific workforce, in that we face, our world, complex and urgent scientific challenges. And so it's imperative that all individuals that wish to contribute to science are able to do so and have the opportunity to do so. And that should include LGBTQ individuals, right? So regardless of equal opportunities issues, it's critical from maximizing the talents and skills of the scientific workforce that we include all kinds of individuals and make sure that there are no biases or issues in the pipeline for these kinds of people. And sadly, we know from other underrepresented groups where there are far more data that biases do exist in the scientific community. So for example, STEM fields in which scientists harbor stronger stereotypes about gender and racial differences in scientific ability, in terms of sort of inherent abilities, have lower representation of women and Black people in their STEM fields. Black scientists are less successful than white scientists at obtaining NIH grants. And this is also observed for senior women. They're less successful than senior men in obtaining NIH grants. And these effects hold even when accounting for academic pedigree or publication record. And also, white men are disproportionately invited onto panels at scientific conferences. Recently, the NIH director boycotted all male panels. And so we know that these biases can exert an effect on the scientific community. But how do we even know, these sorts of data at kind of a field-wide, STEM-wide level? How do we even know this? And that's something I really want to focus on. And we know this because US STEM institutions, government, universities, funding agencies, scientific societies, track gender and race as part of the demographic measures that they collect in surveys. And most importantly, the National Science Foundation has a responsibility from the 1980 Science and Engineering Equal Opportunities Act to collect official nationwide data on the STEM workforce through essentially a STEM census. So surveys, the National Survey of College Graduates, the Survey of Doctorate Recipients, the Survey of Earned Doctorates together form this kind of STEM census that collects data on college graduates and PhD holders in the United States to get nationally representative data on the progress of the STEM workforce, of potential biases and leaky pipeline issues. these feed into congressionally mandated reports that go to Congress, including the Women, Minorities, and People with Disabilities in Science and Engineering report. And these reports and these data are critical for policies in higher education and diversity efforts at universities and federal funding agencies, and used widely across the country. But what, sex orientation and gender identity have been missing, right? These surveys have existed since 1957, but they have never collected demographic measures of sex orientation and gender identity. And without those measures, there are no official comprehensive nationwide data on the pipeline for LGBTQ people in STEM and potential biases or issues along that pipeline. And so I wound up writing this commentary in Nature from personal experiences continually relayed to me by students, trainees, junior faculty, and some of my own experiences, and looking at these alarming data that I showed you earlier. And really the argument is that it's important to comprehensively think about LGBTQ people in STEM as a STEM diversity issue, that we need the data. We need to understand how LGBTQ people are faring in the STEM workforce. And there are a couple, very, very few studies starting to look at representation and pipeline issues. So for example, without these kinds of official data, some researchers have turned to the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey to look at federal employees in STEM versus non-STEM agencies. And from this, they estimated that LGBTQ people may be 20% less represented in the STEM workforce than expected based on their prevalence in the US population. And you might think, okay, 20%, but LGBTQ people are a pretty small minority of the population. Is this really that important? And when you calculate it, what this implies is that there is a loss of roughly 60,000 to 110,000 LGBTQ people in STEM. If they're 20% less represented, it implies that there are these missing LGBTQ people in the STEM workforce, which is quite a large number of individuals. So it does matter, and it's important to recognize that the LGBTQ population is comparable to the percentage of Asian individuals in the United States. It's even slightly larger by some estimates than the percentage of Black women in the United States, and it's much larger than the percentage of Native Americans in the United States. And the Native Americans and Black women are severely underrepresented in a number of STEM fields. Other data has tried to look at that was sort of using federal agencies to understand an estimate of the STEM workforce broadly, have looked at the pipeline early on at the undergraduate level. And this is looking at the American Community Survey in terms of same-sex versus other-sex couples, because there are no demographic measures of sex orientation and gender identity in these surveys. So the best that researchers can do is look at same-sex versus other-sex couples. And so you're missing all of single individuals in these data. But what these researchers found very recently was that gay men are 12% less likely to complete an undergraduate degree in STEM than straight men. This holds even when you account for a lot of different demographic and educational factors. And this gap, this gay male gap, is smaller than the female gap, the gender gap, and larger than the racial gap in terms of fewer Black individuals than white individuals. So it's a sizable gap that is being observed, at least for gay men. And another study tried to hone in on this a little bit further, finding, here they looked at over 4,000 undergraduates across 78 US universities and looked at who had declared a STEM major or not in their freshman year, and then by graduating, who had stayed or left their STEM field, a STEM major. And so compared to straight men, sexual minority men, so men identifying as gay, bisexual, or queer, were 13%, or 13% of them were less stayed in their STEM major from freshman to senior year. But critically, sexual minority men showed greater signs of interest in STEM than their heterosexual peers. So they were more involved in lab experiences. And so this suggests that they were certainly interested in STEM, but they may have perceived that this was not a place that they would belong or thrive, or received signals from faculty members and lab members that this was perhaps not a place for them. So this from the pipeline framework, right, suggests that there is certainly, it seems like at least for gay men or sexual minority men in the most recent study, are dropping out here, right? But what we need to know, right, these are not official comprehensive data. We need to know what's going on comprehensively across the whole pipeline. And that one estimate of 20% less represented for LGBTQ people comes from federal agencies. We really need this for the STEM workforce in a nationally representative way, and we need to understand how this unfolds at each stage of the career. And so I've become very interested in advocating for comprehensive nationwide data through these NSF surveys. And so, as I said, NSF has not collected sexual orientation or gender identity in these national STEM workforce surveys since 1957. And these STEM workforce surveys, collect these data, and these data go to NSF, and NSF generates these reports, women, minorities, and persons with disabilities in science and engineering report and other reports, which are then used together with the official data by the NIH for diversity fellowships, for example, like the National Research Service Awards, to Congress and to policymakers for science policy, for STEM diversity policy, to university diversity offices across the country for recruiting faculty members and trainees for understanding their own faculty members, graduate students and undergraduates, to researchers to study these issues, of course, and to scientific organizations to track these data in their own scientific societies. So these are really influential. It's important to get these official data. And in an initial discussion with a few colleagues with NSF, they had a number of concerns about collecting this kind of data, and they were not strongly interested from a feasibility standpoint. They're not strongly interested in this initially. And so this led me to reach out to two LGBTQ public policy and legal experts, Adam Romero at the UCLA School of Law and Laura Dorso at the Center for American Progress, who have expertise in working with the federal government to include sex orientation and gender identity with other federal agencies in terms of health and in terms of crime, not anything with STEM or higher education. And these two individuals taught me enormously about how this process works and with the federal government. And what this led to was a public comment that we wrote and submitted to the Federal Register. And when federal agencies, including NSF, are about to undertake a federal data collection, such as these surveys on the US population, they're required to submit a notice in the Federal Register to solicit comments from the general public before they undertake their federal data collection. And so we submitted a 15-page document, right? So an extensive document that outlines the importance and feasibility of collecting sex orientation and gender identity demographic measures in these surveys for advancing the US scientific workforce, and the feasibility and precedent in doing this from other government surveys. And our comment was co-signed by 17 major scientific organizations, and that should say 251. So 251 scientists, engineers, and legal and policy scholars. And at this point, the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Educational Research Association, and specifically Shirley Malcolm and Felice Levine, were very interested and hugely supportive to help our cause with this. And they are people that are prominent leaders in scientific workforce diversity and in higher education issues, and they frequently work from a public policy and a standpoint. And so they were very helpful. They frequently interact with the relevant individuals at NSF, and together they helped us arrange a meeting at NSF headquarters to discuss these issues with the relevant individuals. And we had a meeting in 2018, and ultimately NSF agreed to conduct initial methodological testing, initial piloting on sex orientation and gender identity measures. No promises were made, of course. And from that point, we were hoping to have continued discussion and be in touch about this and your progress. And unfortunately, we haven't been as in touch as we would like, and there are possibly a number of reasons for this. It seems that these efforts have been generally stalled and aren't moving anywhere. But we're certainly not giving up. We're still very interested in this, and a number of major scientific organizations are. And because of the work that we've done, the National Academies invited my colleagues and I to submit information to a study committee of theirs on this issue of data on sex orientation and gender identity of the national STEM workforce, and why this is important, and what steps would be good to try to solve these issues. And we did that, and there is a forthcoming report in probably August of this year, so any moment now, that may make policy recommendations that could add pressure to NSF to really do this. We also know that the House Science Committee in the House of Representatives is is interested in these issues generally, and wants to see these kinds of changes undertaken in federal surveys. But it's also important to recognize that it's a very delicate and elaborate process. NSF has to obtain approval from the Office of Management and Budget, which is in the Executive Office of the President, to add new questions to their federal surveys. And this can be challenging in political administrations. And so there's a lot that political administrations, depending on their say feelings about LGBTQ people or their current policies. So there's a lot of things to be thinking about, but hopefully it seems in time that we will be able to make this kind of progress. But to bring it home and to highlight why I think it's so important to do this and to obtain official federal data on LGBTQ STEM issues, is that if we obtained these data, it would allow researchers and policymakers to track LGBTQ disparities, potentially, if and where they exist, and career and educational barriers, and to develop strategies to increase the retention in STEM and to solve leaky pipeline issues, if they exist. So it would also allow us to understand LGBTQ intersections with gender, race, or economic background. And when you have nationally representative data, you can actually do these subgroup analyses and understand, in different locations of the country and different kinds of demographic intersections, what's going on. It would help universities, funding agencies, and scientific societies to prevent or stop, if already underway, biases, whether explicit or implicit, and pipeline issues. And it could inform NSF and NIH diversity initiatives like the Graduate Research Fellowship Program or National Research Service Awards. It could inform university diversity initiatives for recruiting faculty members and trainees across the country. And also more broadly, it could help change the conversation in STEM, where, like with women and racial and ethnic minorities in STEM, LGBTQ identity becomes a kind of STEM diversity that we should think about, rather than just an irrelevant demographic detail that should have no place in science and engineering. So it could help, in turn, change policies, change the interest, allow researchers to get funding to undertake this kind of work, to study these sorts of issues and better understand the experiences of LGBTQ people in the pipeline of LGBTQ people in STEM. And so I just want to close by thanking enormously Felice Levine at ARA, Shirley Malcolm at AAAS, Adam Romero and Laura Dorso, who have been super helpful and valuable in teaching me a lot about how this process works and helping advocate for this issue with me. And then also my colleagues, Christina Olson, Neil Lewis Jr., and Leah Somerville, for giving a lot of feedback on this process and on different pieces, and really appreciate all of this, and happy to take any questions.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, or virtually coming, to my talk today on the study of trans identity in neuroscience and why I feel like it is a bit stuck in the past. So this is, I think, the point that we can just best choose as the beginning of trans neuroscience, or the study of trans identity in neuroscience. It's this pretty seminal study you may have heard of from 1995 from the lab of Dick Swab in the Netherlands, looking at the BNST, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, a very small part of the brain that shows an interesting sexual dimorphism. Namely, if you stain it, you see that the number of neurons in the BNST is much larger in a heterosexual cisgender man than in a heterosexual cisgender woman. And when they sort of undertook this seminal study, they first looked, okay, what does it look like in gay men? It looks about the same as in heterosexual men, and then discovered that when they took brain samples from trans women, some of whom had undergone transition, they saw that the BNST in trans women far more resembled that in heterosexual cisgender women than it did in cis men. So this study was received with a great deal of fanfare because it seemed to establish something really powerful about trans identity. And this was that, namely, that the idea that a trans person might be trapped in the wrong body, i.e., that they could have a woman's brain and a man's body or vice versa, seemed to be neuroscientifically proven. It seemed like we had found evidence that, trans identity happens because of this particular neuroscientific reason, and more importantly, that it's real and that it's valid. We can sort of dig our fingers into what it means to be trans scientifically. And perhaps unsurprisingly, or maybe even surprisingly, given that this was in the 90s, that sort of coverage that sort of position was focused on in the media coverage. So you have this article, this is from the New York Times, came out around the time the paper was released, and explicitly says that this discovery, and they use the word transsexual, which was unfortunately used in the neuroscientific literature until very recently, that this discovery could at least partly explain why such individuals, why trans folks describe themselves as women trapped in men's bodies. The study only looked at trans women. And so I think it's quite intriguing, not only that the study was set up and presented as a way of showing the neurological basis, the neuroscientific basis of trans identity, but that it was interpreted as such publicly. I think this sort of sequence of events really illustrates the paradigm that this research existed in when it began. And what I'm going to sort of talk about in the rest of my time here is why I think that paradigm really hasn't shifted since 1995. And while it actually, as you could see in this New York Times article, may have accomplished something perhaps progressive, perhaps provided validation and support for the reality and the importance of trans experience, that when we're still stuck in this paradigm in 2020, the results are a little bit less than positive. So now I don't mean to say that all neuroscience research on trans identity today operates under the assumption that trans folks are men trapped in women's bodies or women trapped in men's bodies. That's certainly not true. It's much more common today to see the brain as not necessarily distinctly male or distinctly female, but much more a brain that everyone has that might show some anatomical differences from sex to sex, but that you really can't classify well on the basis of sex. And so the research that we see today, sometimes will uphold the idea of men's and women's brains being different and asking, are trans people more like they're assigned sex at birth, or do their brains look more like those of their gender identity? But there's a lot of work today that takes a different tack, that says, actually, let's assume, that trans brains aren't necessarily like sexed one way or another, because it might be silly to think of brains as being sexed one way or another anyway, but that for trans folks, there's something specific going on in their brain. There's maybe some specific locus that changes things, that makes them feel that their gender is opposite to the sex that they were assigned at birth. And then ask this question, can we find that locus? The idea being that if we find that locus of trans identity, again, we will have shown that trans identity is real and gotten more insight into how it works. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one particular lab, one particular line of research that takes this approach. The intent of this is not to necessarily target this group. I think they're extremely well-intentioned, but sort of to give an illustrative example of what I think the research looks like today and why that might be a little problematic. So I think probably the most prominent example of research in this vein comes from the SAVIC lab in Sweden. And they have sort of, in the past 5 years, really put forward this theory that what makes a brain a trans brain is having some disruption in the systems by which the brain, relates oneself to one's body, in the sense of possessing one's own body. And in sort of the first paper in which they purported to find a difference between what they call the own body network in cis folks and trans folks, they say, explicitly here that these convergent findings posit a tentative neurobiological basis for the dysphoric experience of transsexuals. Again, using that somewhat outdated language, which was used in the neuroscientific literature until quite recently. So Yeah, they're not quite saying that trans men have women's brains and trans women have men's brains, and that's necessarily how it has to work. But they are saying that this neurobiological difference that they say that they found between cis folks and trans folks is the basis for the dysphoric experience. Essentially, saying this basis for trans experience, that it just comes from this difference in how you neurologically relate to your body. Now, there are other concerns we might bring up with this work. For example, that they just see some statistical differences between fairly small samples of trans and cis folks, and then engage in reverse inference to say what those differences might mean. But I'm more sort of interested in interrogating the rhetoric here. And I think this rhetoric is precisely the same rhetoric that we see in the Schwab paper from 1995, that we found trans identity in the brain, that we can explain what it is to be trans now, that we've localized it and we've made it real. And in 1995, this may have been very progressive. I don't think the same can be true said today. Just to also sort of demonstrate that this sort of rhetoric has continued in this vein of research up until the present day, here's a paper from this lab that was coming out this year, or has just come out this year, I believe. And again, you sort of basically, they, again, are looking at this idea of the own body network being different in trans folks, and showing them, morphed images of, their body looking more like their assigned sex at birth and their body looking more like their gender identity, and basically say, oh, well, we found that, brain activity for trans folks looked more similar when they were, looking at a body that looked like their gender identity, as to cis folks looking at a body that was like their gender identity, which seems like maybe a little bit of a non-result. And then they're saying they show more limbic activation in trans folks during this entire experiment. Again, to me, those are results that scream, well, of course, that's hardly surprising. We know something about what trans experience looks like if we listen to trans people and what they say about how they relate to their own bodies. And so it's very unclear to me that finding this neurological data says anything about the nature of trans identity, and yet they sort of describe the results as shedding light on the underlying self-processing networks specific to gender identity, and uncover additional involvement of emotional processing in trans individuals. The rhetoric's a little more subtle there, but to me, it still sort of has this force of, we're figuring out what is underlying trans identity, what's underlying dysphoria, what's underlying the trans experience, and we can do that by interrogating the brain. And another dimension of the way in which this research is still, I think, quite trapped in this paradigm from 25 years ago has to do with how it has adapted or failed to adapt to what trans identity looks like today. If you look for research on non-binary identities, which have become increasingly popular identity labels for folks in the trans community, especially younger folks, it's very common for folks who identify as non-binary or genderqueer today. There's almost no research to that effect. And so while taking on a scientific paradigm that I think is somewhat of the past, these researchers are also taking on a paradigm or an understanding of trans identity that was much more accurate in 1995 than it is today. And so this is how we would overall summarize what I've found in the literature from around the past 5 years on trans identity, of which the Saavik work was sort of an exemplar. The subjects are almost always binary identified. They're almost all pre-hormone treatment and gender confirmation surgery. And the explanations are always reductive, down to looking specifically for some locus or some characterization of the brain that makes a person trans. They'll generally be all or nothing. Either you're this way and you're trans, or you're that way and you're cis, and they're always non-social. They always ignore the possibility of social factors being involved. And again, the moral of that story is that we remain in this Swabian paradigm from 1995 that I do not think is adequate to interrogating these issues today. If we think about gender today, I think we should think of it much more in this sort of way, where we think of it as a complicated causal net that integrates biological and social factors in an indivisible sense. And when we're looking at trans individuals, that gets even more complicated, because we have folks who are getting gender confirmation surgery, taking hormones, who are often completely shut out of the literature, although that is less true in recent years. And what the literature is generally trying to do is artificially slice the nature of sex and gender for these individuals, and just take out certain factors, take out these biological factors, and take out the brain from its social environment. And I think that is ultimately a strategy that is doomed to failure, as well as a strategy that can have extremely negative results. You may be familiar with this paper from this year that essentially was retracted later, or this past year rather, and argued that trans identity was essentially something in need of a cure. And I think that this neurobiological approach, we're looking for that specific individual marker of trans identity rather than seeing it as an emergent product of a mixed biological and social system, encourages us to think of trans identity as something that can be cured and that needs to be cured. So, I don't necessarily say all of this to be a defeatist or negative. While I think that the research hasn't necessarily progressed as much as we would like in the past 25 years, or at least the ways that we think about trans identity in neuroscience haven't progressed terribly much, I do think there's reason to be hopeful. And I think that's really well illustrated by this paper that came out this year with Dick Swab as one of the co-authors that actually really interrogates gender and sex and gender identity are extraordinarily complex. We're not able to isolate them from their social environment, and we can't necessarily take individual loci and say that this makes you male or this makes you female or this makes you trans and this makes you cis. And so seeing signs like that, I think are really encouraging. I think to move this research forward, we have to think more capaciously. We have to engage with folks from other disciplines who also think about trans identity in a more social context. And I think if we do that, there is a great future for this research, but unfortunately, as of now, we are not yet there. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Doug VanderLaan from the University of Toronto. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present as part of this year's Diversity Symposium. The title of my talk is Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Development, Insights from Thai Gay Men and Sal Prabhat-Song. For decades, the neurohormonal hypothesis has been a key framework for understanding sex differences in the brain and behavior. This hypothesis posits two types of effects. There are prenatal organizational effects in which sex hormones, especially androgens, organize the brain in a male or female typical manner. At puberty and through adulthood, sex hormones like testosterone in males and estrogen in females activate or trigger male or female typical expression in the brain, depending on how it was organized previously. And that's shown in the figure to the right. In the cases of same-sex sexual orientation and transgender identity, this hypothesis posits that the brain was organized in another birth sex manner. For example, if an individual is assigned male at birth, based on the appearance of the external genitalia, but has a female typical brain organization due to relatively low androgen exposure prenatally, then the rise in testosterone at puberty will have little to no effect on the brain and behavior, and the individual will display a more female typical expression. Guillemot and colleagues argued that this neurohormonal hypothesis or process is reflected in the cortical thickness and proposed a cortical theory of transfeminine identity. Transfeminine referring to individuals assigned male at birth who identify as women or with femininity more so than masculinity. This theory is based on observations that cortical thickness decreases with age, particularly over adolescence, and typically more so in males due to the greater action of androgens in the cortex. As shown in this figure, compared to male controls, both female controls and trans women had thicker cortex in certain regions, highlighted in orange and red, suggesting transfeminine individuals' brains are organized in a more female typical manner and are less sensitive to androgens. Thus, cortical thickness might be a useful metric for investigating brain organization and activational sensitivity to androgens. But of course, this is a nascent area and there are gaps. First, both sexual orientation and gender identity are hypothesized to be influenced by sex hormones. But only 3 studies so far have looked at cortex in male sexual orientation, and they've produced mixed findings. Second, only 1 study has directly compared these 2 traits, and it found white matter structure differences related to transgender identity only, not sexual orientation. And third, the neurohormonal hypothesis should apply across populations, but there's been little MRI work in this field from outside of Western countries. By my count, only 2 of 66 studies in the MRI literature, both resting state fMRI studies from South Korea. To address these gaps, I've been conducting a neuroimaging study with researchers and neuroscientists at Chiang Mai University in northern Thailand. This is Dr. Suitseiko, my main collaborator there. I chose Thailand as a cross-cultural site for research because sexually and gender diverse populations are relatively accepted and highly visible there. In Thai culture, as in the West, straight men and women are cisgender. That is, their gender expression aligns with the cultural norms for their birth sex. And they're sexually attracted to members of the other birth sex. Within Thai conceptions of gender, they also recognize a number of groups as what they call Pet T Sam, or a third gender or a third sex. Gay men are considered a kind of third gender in Thailand, but similar to the West, they're assigned male at birth, they present in a masculine fashion, and they're sexually attracted to men. Another third gender group is Sao Prapet Song, which translates as a second kind of woman. They're assigned male at birth and, similar to trans women in the West, are markedly feminine and take on female-type social roles. They're also sexually attracted to men. An important aspect to mention is that specialty care in relation to gender is not accessible in Thailand. And so during adolescence, many Sao Prapet Song self-administer exogenous feminizing hormones, typically synthetic estrogens and oral contraceptive pills that they can buy through pharmacies. To suppress, they use these pills to suppress male secondary sex characteristics and promote female appearance. And this is important because such hormone use would reduce testosterone in the body and obviously increase estrogen in the body and perhaps maintain thicker cortex. Given this background, research questions I'll address in this presentation include, in Thailand, does thicker cortex correspond to birth-assigned sex, sexual attraction, gender identification, or some combination of all of these? Again, the cortical theory suggests is particular to feminine gender identification, so straight cis women and Sao Prapet Song should show the thickest cortex. Also, because exogenous feminizing hormones reduce testosterone and increase estrogen in the body, is cortex thicker among Sao Prapet Song who have used hormones compared to those who have never used them? Or is cortex thicker among Sao Prapet Song who started using hormones at an earlier age? To address these questions, I'm going to share some cortical thickness data from our Thai sample of straight men and women, gay men, and Sao Prapet Song. We still have 20 or so participants to recruit, so the data I will present are preliminary and largely for illustration purposes. Also, you might notice that our Sao Prapet Song so far are younger on average, so in the analyses I'll present, we did control for age in any analyses involving Sao Prapet Song. So our participants were recruited through sexual health clinics affiliated with Chiang Mai University. All were screened as HIV negative. The HU minus group of Sao Prapet Song reported no lifetime use of exogenous feminizing hormones, that's hormone use minus. And the HU plus group of Sao Prapet Song reported at least 6 months of hormone use without discontinuing for a period of more than 6 months at any point. Average age at onset of use was 17 years old, with a range of 12 to 20 years. Regarding sexual orientation, all men were exclusively attracted to women, and all other participants were exclusively attracted to men. Cortical thickness was assessed from T1 weighted images acquired on a 1.5 Tesla Philips scanner. Images were processed using FreeSurfer, and we used the Destro Atlas to define cortical regions. Given the data are preliminary, the analyses here are intended to be illustrative of the kinds of patterns we're interested to investigate. As shown by the warmer colors, red and yellow, in the figure, our data so far do indicate cortex tends to be thicker in Thai straight women than straight men, and this applied to areas across the brain, as you can see. Now, when we juxtapose these sex-differentiated cortical regions with patterns seen in gay men and Sao Prapet Song's cortical thickness, we find 3 basic patterns. And I'm going to go over each of these patterns and show data from an exemplar region for each, with the figures showing error bars that are 95% confidence intervals. So first, there were 5 regions in which thickness was related to birth-assigned sex. From left to right in this figure, you can see straight cis men, gay cis men, and both groups of Sao Prapet Song had thinner cortex than straight cis women. Second, in 2 regions, groups of individuals who were attracted to men had thicker cortex than straight cis men. which was the only group that's attracted to women. And third, there was one region where the female identified groups, that is straight cis women in Sauerkraut song, had thicker cortex than the male identified groups, which were straight and gay cis men. So these patterns suggest that depending on the region in question, cortical thickness could reflect organization by sex, sexual orientation, or gender identification. We did not find cortical thickness differences among Sauerkraut song in relation to hormone use. However, in 2 regions, we did find that earlier age at onset of hormone use was associated with thicker cortex. This included the region that was differentiated based on gender identification in the previous slide, the right planum temporale, and the right posterior transverse collateral sulcus. These correlations are consistent with the idea that exogenous estrogen and/or lowering of testosterone earlier acts as a buffer against cortical thinning, at least in some sex-differentiated regions. So to provide a summary and some tentative conclusions in relation to these preliminary data, with regard to the cortical theory of transfeminine identity, cortical thickness holds promise as a marker of brain organization and sensitivity to activational effects of sex hormones, but it might not be specific to transfeminine identification. It could be related to sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity, and this may vary depending on the cortical region in question, which suggests, of course, a need for more MRI studies that consider all 3 variables simultaneously in order to make the findings less ambiguous. Regarding hormone use in Sauerkraut song, there was some evidence that age at onset of use is related to cortical thickness, which to me points to a need for more trans brain health research in relation to hormone use, as well as more specialized trans healthcare in Thailand, and probably also countries with similar circumstances in which individuals who are trans are self-administering hormones without medical supervision. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors on this work, including trainees in my lab at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and my collaborators at Chiang Mai University. Also, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada for funding this Thai neuroimaging work. And a special thanks to all those who agreed to participate. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take questions, hopefully during the meeting, but otherwise by email at doug.vanderlaan@utoronto.ca.
Hello, I wish you a very warm welcome to the OHBM 2020 Conference Diversity Forum. I would like to thank the organization for giving me the opportunity to talk, and my special thanks to Dr. Lucina Uddin for helping me organizing this. I'm Jonathan Vanhoecke. I'm an interdisciplinary scientist specialized in neuroimaging and gender studies. I'm currently active at the Humboldt University, Berlin. In neuroscience, sex and gender questions are a very hot topic. How can we understand gender and sex effects in Alzheimer's disease? And why do gender and sex have an impact on clinical depression? Even in fields of neuroscience in which gender and sex are not studied per se, it is still a very weighty topic. As researchers have to be confronted with very stingy questions about gender and sex. For instance, in an evaluation of a new drug for neurological disease, certain gender disbalance in a cohort, does that matter? Is that problematic? Do you need to correct for gender or for sex or for both? Or do you actually want to correct for brain volume or brain size? And how? This is what I would like to discuss, the importance of sex and gender in neuroscientific research. The aim for this talk is not to provide any empirical proof, not to trash any paper. It's certainly not to impose theoretical framework for neuroscience research about dealing with sex and gender issues. What I do aim for instead is to shed light on sex and gender questions on a meta level, starting from a close-up debate within the trans community and the neuroscientific research about it, and then what it is to observe gender and sex effects in any neuroscience fields. This is the main structure of my talk. 1. Where do I detect a problem? 2. How to define this problem? And 3. What does the problem imply? 1. Where do I detect a problem? I stumbled upon the following. Transgender people are an excellent paradigm to disentangle sex effects from gender effects on the brain. Despite this is a thought I had myself, and therefore I'm sharing a self-criticism with you, I truly think that this is a problematic thought because it is relying on critical assumptions. Let's analyze together. So transgender people are being assigned a certain sex at birth that is different from their gender. Despite there is an accusation of the conceptual difference between sex and gender, the biological mechanism has not been clarified at all. For instance, when I see a paper about Alzheimer's disease and one author writes there is a gender effect and the other authors write there is a sex effect, then, well, it's quite problematic because I'm assuming that the sex effect is maybe more neurobiological of nature, and the gender effect is more behavioral and sociological of nature. But actually, nobody knows what is being measured, sex or gender. It brings us to the very question, how to distinguish brain effects from effects of sociological behavior. Is it the case that sex provides a certain determination in how the brain develops, a certain vulnerability that can be displayed to a lesser or pure extent in, for instance, for a certain disease that we want to understand better? Or is it fundamentally the opposite around, that gender has some certain corresponding gender role, and in having this gender role, it makes the brain change over time? 2. How to define this problem? Piling up sex and gender implies a risk of misunderstanding the biological mechanism in which sex and gender effects are present or just absent in the brain. Moreover, piling up sex and gender entails an ethical risk of stereotyping certain communities, for instance, but not limited to the transgender community. And further, piling up sex and gender entails a risk on miscommunicating, what makes the research not reproducible and not accurate. How often do we read in a method section, this cohort has been corrected for age, for handness, and for sex? Or was it actually meant gender? Or brain volume, or brain size, or what? Or why does it matter? It is these risks on misunderstanding, risk on ethical underassessment, a risk on miscommunicating, that is the core problem of piling up sex and gender. 3rd, what does this problem imply? It is the right timing to stand still, to analyze the use of terminology, not only in interaction with the trans community, but in the broader field of neuroscience. The mere conception of sex and gender, despite its neurobiological implications, is in very essence a sociological conundrum. But because scholars specialized in gender studies within the wider realm of sociology do not share the same platforms such as PubMed or this very OHBM conference, it is very hard to build bridges. Moreover, where neuroscience have the inherent propensity to look and to assess for statistical differences, sociology and gender studies rely on similarities for analytical approaches. So I don't think that there is a straightforward solution, and I certainly do not have a lot of answers. I have a lot of questions, but I know that as any good scientist, we have a certain responsibility for the content we produce and share the obligation not to stigmatize a certain population. How do we build these bridges with the gender studies department, with the sociology department that is present in every single university? We need to find a certain synergy between those two fields, because in the end, you know, we all try to help people, but in trying to help people, how do we avoid the risk of inflicting on those people that we try to help, being it the patients, minority groups, or participants that we have recruited for the study? I conclude that from this thought example of sex and gender assessment in the trans community, that we can easily get lost in a quagmire in which sex and gender concepts are applied to explain neurobiological mechanisms, but have a very sociological content. On this very intersection of research fields, I hope to find more answers in the future. I would like to thank the Belgian American Education Foundation and the Vocational Organization for financially supporting me. I would like to thank Dr. Catherine Jacke, Dr. Jimmy Fusner, Dr. Paul Thompson, not because they have contributed to the content of this talk, but because they have inspired me so much about this very topic in the last years. And I would like to thank you, dear listener, for your attention.